Hey folks, Andy here, and welcome to an introduction, a very brief one, for the next author that I'm going to be tackling, the British horror author this time, James Herbert. The very first horror author that I ever read, and still one of my all-time favourite horror authors. James Herbert was a quintessentially British author, and a lot of the language and wording he used were very British. As a result, I think some other countries, especially in America, might have had a slightly difficult time relating to or understanding some of the phrases and wording that he used. So he's not as universal as perhaps some American authors that I think over here in the UK we kind of adapt to a little better in terms of slang and language. And he did have sometimes a slightly dated style in that his earliest books in the 70s feel like 70s products, but some of his later books feel a good decade or two behind, when they were actually written. He doesn't really change his style that much. But in saying that, he did adapt and evolve as a writer over the decades that he wrote, and he wrote for a significant amount of time. His first novel, The Rats, was released in 1974. His final novel, Ash, was released in 2012. So he had almost 40 years of writing. And sadly died very suddenly after Ash at the age of 69, despite the fact that he wrote for longer than Richard Lehman and was significantly older than Richard Lehman when he died. He only actually produced 23 full-length novels. So this series is going to be a little shorter than the Richard Lehman series. There's some fairly lengthy gaps between some of these book publications. And there's quite a few arcs and eras that Herbert wrote. His works have various degrees of style, and as we'll go through them, you'll see that there's a very definite shift in how he wrote. But in saying that, I personally love the vast majority of James Herbert's work. He has written some really bad books, but he's also written some genuinely fantastic horror. Whereas I enjoy for who he was Richard Lehman's works, and the top 10 Richard Lehman books are books that I love. They're guilty pleasures, so to speak. Even his very best book, in my opinion, which is Savage, isn't a great book in comparison with a lot of other authors. It's just a guilty pleasure and it's fun. But I think that some of Herbert's best books are absolutely the best, amongst the best horror I've ever read. He was a phenomenally talented author and quite a private man. So I'm going to get on with looking at these 23 books. I'm not going to be touching any of the non-fiction stuff. He did write a couple of non-fiction books, and he even wrote a graphic novel called The City, which is part of his Rats series. But being as these aren't either novels or horror novels or, connected to his main body of work, so to speak, I'm only going to be looking at the 23 books that he actually put out under his own name. It's interesting as well that, as far as I know, there are no books that Herbert wrote with pseudonyms or alternative pen names, and he also doesn't have any unfinished or unpublished works lying around. What you saw is what you got. He wrote books until their completion, then moved on to another one. But it's a bit sad that there's no hidden treasures of Herbert lying around. I would have liked to have had the chance to read some of those, but it is what it is. But yeah, we're going to start off with the 23rd book. And moving our way to the first book in my list. And it's always, as ever with these rankings, the very first books I talk about are always a bit sad in the sense that I'm talking about his worst stuff first. So there's always an aura of negativity over the first few videos. But I will just leave it being said that, again, Herbert was the first horror author I ever read, and I would still put him in my top 10 favourite horror authors of all time. So that should showcase the fact that this is a man whose legacy I think was cut tragically short, and whose best books I still reread now and think of them as masterpieces, really. I think he's a phenomenal horror author and very ahead of his time. He's one of the first horror authors, certainly British horror authors, to have a grasp of more modern language and throw in shocking amounts of violence and gore, and yes, even sex at times into his works. A decade before a lot of other people were jumping on board. So, like I say, his first novel came out in 1974, and it was so far ahead of its time in terms of its content, I think. And we'll go through that as we go on. So, James Herbert, one of Britain's very best. I mean, he listed himself as a chiller writer. He was a horror author, but I can understand why he used the term chiller. And he's the next author we'll be going through. I will be talking about Bentley Little after I've done this, but I want to get through Herbert first, only because all this stuff's fresh in my mind. I had to go back through some of the books I hadn't read for a while and just reread them, as well as reacquaint myself with some of the books I have read recently, just to refamiliarise myself with it. So, James Herbert, up next.